Welcome classic rock fans to another episode of Worst to Best, and today I'd like to talk about Iron Maiden. In part, this video has been inspired by me listening to all these wonderful sort of new Maiden issues, sort of repackaging and remastering of all these classic albums. I think they come from the 2015 remasters, but they're certainly a notch up from the CDs I used to have, my original CDs that is. So anyway, I'll preface this video with saying, as I always do, that this is just my opinion. This is how I rank the albums due to my own personal preference. Yours may differ from that, which is absolutely fine. I'd love to hear from you in terms of how you would rank these albums. I will also stress that it's really difficult sort of ranking these albums. It's like saying which child do you want to lose, especially when you get into that sort of top 10 that becomes incredibly condensed with absolute awesomeness, if you like. Anyway, let's get on with it. So coming in at number 16 is Virtual 11, which was released in 1998. Of course, this is the famous Blaze Bayley era. I think what these albums do for me is they establish straight away how important Dickinson's tonsils are to the sort of Maiden identity. And for me, this album is a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I think Educated Fool is a great track, but The Angel and the Gambler is certainly a track I could do without ever hearing again, to be honest with you. One critic has described this album as sucking like an airplane toilet, which seems a little bit harsh because it does have some merit. For example, I think some of the solos on this album are really outstanding, and certainly a shout has to go out to the wonderful track The Klansman, which is on this one. It's very dark, it's very brooding. In fact, Gary Bushell has described it as being as cheerful as Ibsen with hemorrhoids. But for me, I think these albums suffer a little bit of what I call, there's an anxiety of influence there in many respects, in the sense that we associate a specific voice with Iron Maiden's music now. Now, I know Bruce Dickinson wasn't the original singer. Of course, we had Paul Di'Anno before Bruce Dickinson. And even before Bruce Dickinson, we had, I think it was Paul Day and Dennis Wilcox, if that's right. So obviously he wasn't the original singer, but there's no doubt in my mind that it's his voice that is part of that sort of Maiden identity now. Number 15 is No Prayer for the Dying, which came out in 1990. For me, I find this album to be quite mediocre stuff, really. It creaks under the indifference from the sort of band members to try and find something, find a spark. Of course, I think Adrian Smith had already departed before this album came out. I think Holy Smoke is a good number. It's fun. I do like that one, but I think the standout track is Tail Gunner, especially that wonderful bass flourish by Steve Harris at the beginning. I think it's a great song. But the rest of it I could take or leave, really. Mostly leave, to be honest with you. I think Martin Popoff said the band were trying to build shoddy replicas of older anthems on this album. For me, this album certainly seems bereft of any really good ideas. Number 14 is The X Factor, the first Blaze Bayley album. Now, I think Blaze Bayley suffers a lot because he's brought in to fill some pretty big shoes, isn't he? And I don't know how you're going to fill to replace Bruce Dickinson in a band that's as well established as Iron Maiden. It's going to be a tough gig, no matter how you paint it. And he does a great job, I think. All due respect to him. This album is full of sort of, some have said, very self-indulgent, doom-laden sort of dirges, which don't quite work in many respects. Although Steve Harris has gone on to list this as one of his personal favourites. Number 13 is The Dance of Death, which came out in 2003. It's an absolutely dreadful cover, to be honest with you. I think, isn't this the one where the cover was unfinished by the artist, I think, but nevertheless, I think it's a dreadful cover. I think a lot of the material on this album lacks that kind of familiar sort of Maiden character, which it just seems to sort of lack conviction, in my opinion. Maybe I haven't given it enough listens, perhaps, but in saying that, it does contain the wonderful epic Maiden number, Passchendaele or Passchendaele, depending on which side of the channel you live on, which is definitely worth buying just to hear that song. Number 12 is Matter of Life and Death from 2006. Again, another cover which I'm not overly impressed with. This album feels like a very sobering tract on sort of age and mortality, and it has a kind of a more downbeat and slower feel to some of the sort of other Dickinson sort of Maiden era stuff. And when I listen to this album, I find myself kind of missing those sort of valiant tales from literature and sort of history books that we kind of associate with Iron Maiden now, to be honest with you. It does contain songs the songs I really do like on this album. It does contain The Longest Day and The Reincarnation of Benjamin Bragg, which are standout numbers for me. Number 11 is Iron Maiden's debut album. Now, I realise this might upset some of you, as some of you rate this album really highly. It's been a very important Maiden album, and it is a very important Maiden album. Debut albums tend to be significant simply for the fact that they are debut albums. Of course, this album came out in 1918 and keeps pretty good company with Motorhead's Ace of Spades. Saxon's Wheels of Steel came out at the same time, not to mention Judas Priest's British Steel. They all sort of emerge onto the scene at about this time. And this album is certainly a statement of intent. I think the writer Ian Christie has said that this album is imbued with a sense of English fog and cobblestones, and it's like a visit to the London dungeon. And it's got kind of a refreshing sort of feel to it at a time when artists like Alice Cooper was burnt out at the time. Kiss had gone all sort of pop disco and didn't really know where they were. And this album has certainly a high energy, high intensity feel to it. And certainly tracks like, for example, Running Free and Phantom of the Opera are still fan favourites. Much has been said by Maiden fans of the sort of lacklustre production on this album. I'm not sure I agree with that at all, but the production was by a chap called Will Malone. Of course, this album is the only appearance of guitarist Dennis Stratton. But it does have an energy and an almost punk-like vibe to it. That's probably Di'Anno's influence, I don't know. But obviously the band went out on tour with Kiss at this juncture to support them as they were promoting the Unmasked album. My word, what a contrast that must have been. Number 10 is Killers from 1981. I think sonically they take a step up from their debut album. Of course, Martin Birch comes in as producer. Martin Birch, of course, who previously produced Blue Oyster Cult and other bands, I believe. Paul Di'Anno has said he feels that this album is too fancy. Maybe he was perhaps feeling a little bit uncomfortable with his metal persona, I don't know. Of course, it has the wonderful Wrathchild on it, and that's what Genghis Khan is certainly putting down a marker in terms of where Maiden were going to go. It's certainly an album that paves the way for the brilliance that is Number of the Beast. But for the reasons I gave before for their debut album, this album is at number 10 for me. Okay, let's resume. So number 9 for me is The Final Frontier, which came out in 2010. And this seems to me to be a bit of a Marmite album. I've spoken to Maiden fans who feel that this album is not as great as it should be. I really like this album. I think it really sparks sort of ideas, and one thing I love about this band is that they're not afraid to experiment with sort of time signatures and sort of this cross-pollination of musical form. I suspect that comes from Steve Harris's interest in progressive rock music, like Yes, and of course Jethro Tull. And you can no doubt see those sort of progressive elements that influenced Maiden throughout their career in many respects. But there's a lot of stuff on this album, for example, that's really outstanding. For example, in many ways it has a ferocity that kind of almost out Metallica's Metallica. But I love Mother of Mercy is fantastic. The Alchemist and that When the Wind Blows is just pure unabashed Maiden. Now the reason this album is languishes at number 9 for me is a testimony not to how not great this album is, but how brilliant the albums are above it that it has to compete with. Number 8 for me is Fear of the Dark from 1992, and this album was a well-needed antidote to the artistic disappointment that was No Prayer for the Dying. I think the band felt with certainly No Prayer for the Dying they'd kind of dropped a bollock really, and they really needed to up their game for this album, and it certainly is outstanding, I think. John Tucker wrote that he feels the band at this time were feeling the kind of pressure and threat from some of the emerging bands like Dream Theater. Dream Theater are a band that I feel owe a huge debt to a band like Iron Maiden. This album, of course, sees Steve Harris as a co-producer, I believe. I think it was the last album before Bruce Dickinson's departure, but nevertheless, wonderful songs, of course, like Be Quick or I'll Be Dead, which I think got to number 2 in the UK charts. But it has a ferocity which is well needed, considering the rather lame, mediocre album that preceded it, in my opinion. And this album, of course, certainly doesn't disappoint. It's full of sort of outstanding sort of Maiden moments, like Afraid to Shoot Strangers, Fear is the Key, and of course Childhood's End. All definitely worth a listen. Number 7 is Somewhere in Time from 1986. I really do like this album, but I do feel that this album does creak under the strain of sort of artistic tensions. I read somewhere that Bruce Dickinson doesn't actually contribute to any of the songs on this album in terms of writing, that is. So I suppose it fell mainly upon Steve Harris's shoulder to do most of the writing. I think Bruce Dickinson wanted to move the band in a kind of an acoustic direction, which was promptly rejected. Sonically, it sounds very different from that sort of holy trinity of Maiden albums, Number of the Beast, Powerslave, and Peace of Mind, of course. And I mainly attribute that to the use of synthesizers or synth guitars, or something like that they use on this particular album. It certainly marks it as sounding slightly un-Maidenish when considering the three albums that we'd been listening to prior to the release of this one. Of course, Bruce Dickinson at the time was looking for something less formulaic, he said, but this album certainly does have some standout tracks. For example, Stranger in a Strange Land. Alexander the Great is a fabulous track as well. It does feel somewhat forced to me in some respects, like they've got a backing track and they're kind of reading out facts from the biography really over top of it. It does seem a little bit it doesn't seem to flow as nicely as something, or as well conceived as something like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Number 6, I've put Brave New World from 2000, that millennial year. Of course, it was the album that marked the return of Bruce Dickinson, which was, I think, certainly celebrated by fans and critics alike. The album, I think, is ambitious. It has lots of very melodic riffs and some wonderful sort of 3-guitar interplay. It's certainly a statement of intent that was well needed after the sort of the Blaze Bayley era. I love the cover of this album. I love that kind of hybrid of the illustration by Derek Riggs and I think digital artist Steve Stone. I think bringing those two together for this album marks kind of a new millennia for Iron Maiden. How significant. I love the title track, of course, A Brave New World, based on that wonderful dystopian novel by Aldous Huxley. Not the first time Aldous Huxley, of course, has inspired musical greatness. Of course, I'm referring to the Doors. Interestingly, in an interview by Adrian Smith, he says that some of the tracks on this album were reworkings of songs that they'd already written for Virtual 11. Songs like, for example, The Nomad, Dream of Mirrors, and The Mercenary. But nevertheless, I think this album certainly works, and it was certainly a welcome sort of heralding of brilliance for Maiden. Number 5 for me is Number of the Beast, which came out in 1982. Very much honour of this t-shirt, of course, but it's the album that really sets the ball rolling for me. It's the one that introduces me to Iron Maiden. I remember seeing them doing Run to the Hills on Top of the Pops with that very now familiar sort of Maiden gallop to it. It was absolutely stunning, remarkable stuff. Songs like Hallowed Be Thy Name and one of the standout tracks on this album, Children of the Damned. I mean, how awesome is this record? And that wonderful reading from the Book of Revelations that prefaces perhaps Maiden's most famous of numbers, of course, the album's title track. It's easy to understand why this album forms a central pillar around which Maiden build any live set they're going to do. I read somewhere, actually, interesting enough, that the song Invaders is rarely performed live, or perhaps has never been performed live, but I'll leave that to all the Maidenologists out there. So anyway, number 5, Number of the Beast, what a great album that was. Number 4 is this one, Book of Souls, an absolutely from 2015, absolutely stunning record. In fact, it was described by Classic Rock as it's hard to think of another band of this vintage that would be capable of sounding this vital and inspired at this juncture. I mean, he's absolutely right. It's a wonderful album, cerebral, evocative. The opening track, If Eternity Should Fail, is one of my favourite all-time Maiden numbers. It's right up there. And I love that the epic Empire of the Clouds. I know it's a polarising number. Some people have expressed some dissatisfaction or dislike of it, but I think it's absolutely wonderful. Obviously, it tells the story of the airship R101, which crashed on its maiden journey in northern France. What a brilliant story, how it's told, how it's put together. Full credit to Bruce Dickinson for that one. I love the artwork as well, that kind of tribute to sort of Mayan culture, that sort of ancient civilization. Apparently they consulted experts to make sure they got the artwork just right. And it links, of course, to the actual title track, Book of Souls. Not that the Mayan dynasty actually kept a Book of Souls, but they were certainly interested in the idea of the existence of human souls. Also, Red and the Black is a wonderful song, apparently attributed or influenced by a French novel from 1830 called Le Rouge et le Noir. You have to excuse my bad French. Also, Tears of a Clown, a Steve Harris penned number as a tribute to Robin Williams. It imbues a sense of pathos and is incredibly moving. I think even Bruce Dickinson has said it's one of the standout tracks on the album. So, Book of Souls is a real stand-up moment for Iron Maiden. Number 3 is A Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. You try saying that after a few beers, which obviously was released in 1988. A wonderful album that it ranks very highly amongst the Maiden faithful, an interesting and creative foray into the world of the concept album. I find it really, really interesting, actually, because at this time, of course, the concept album was a dirty word. I mean, copies of Topographic Oceans were changing hands in brown paper wrapping at the time. But nevertheless, it's those of us like myself that were desperately trying to find the story while listening to the album and sort of struggling to do so, felt that it was rather vague. But Bruce Dickinson has gone on record as saying that there is no story, there's no narrative to it. It's just thematically about the struggle between good and evil, very much like all Iron Maiden records are in many respects. Nevertheless, it does pull on, certainly influenced by the, I think it was the book, Orson Scott Card's fantasy novel Seventh Son. Steve Harris was reading that at the time, but it's also influenced by Bruce Dickinson's interest in the occultist Aleister Crowley and the idea of the Moonchild. But it works beautifully. Sonically, it sounds fantastic, from those opening acoustic chords all the way through to standout tracks like the Clairvoyant, I think, which is influenced by British medium Doris Stokes. I remember her. But the idea, of course, the album is about this mythical sort of figure that would be born at a certain time and be imbued with sort of paranormal gifts. So you get that as a kind of theme that runs through it. But it's a remarkable album. I love the artwork for this album as well, but it is certainly a remarkable album and certainly deserves to be in anybody's top 5. Number 2 is Powerslave from 1984. This album is a real tour de force, and it establishes Maiden as one of the most powerful bands around at the time, I think. It's an album of real magnitude. It's sonically, it takes a step up, I think, from Peace of Mind. But also, it has two of my most favourite Maiden numbers on it, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and Powerslave. But the sound, it has almost a cinematic sort of feel to it. It sounds absolutely fantastic. And number 1, of course, is Peace of Mind from 1983. I think this album takes a step up from Number of the Beast, which is hard to imagine. But Number of the Beast, of course, was a transitional album in many respects. This one is much more accomplished, I believe, in terms of its songwriting and structures. It's the first album to feature Nico McBrain, of course, who comes in as the drummer with this album. It's also, I love the theme or the ideas of madness and insanity, or insane ideas are constantly explored beautifully on this record. I love all the cross-cultural references you get on this record. You do throughout Maiden's career, but it's certainly apparent on this album with songs like The Tamer Land and, of course, the references to Frank Herbert's Dune, as well as Where Eagles Dare, of course. It was wonderful to hear them do Where Eagles Dare on the Legacy of the Beast tour. I think it was the second or third number that actually did into the set. Worked brilliantly. And of course the Trooper, of course, wonderful homage or tribute to Alfred Lord Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, a poem that is essentially about the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War. What do I like about the Trooper? It's got that galloping rhythm, which is very much in keeping with the poem itself, which also uses dactylic meter to establish that sense of pace and that sort of galloping rhythm to it as well. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful stuff. Revelations is a standout track for me on this album. I love the chorus and the melodies established by the guitars that sort of intertwine. It's absolutely sublime. Brilliant stuff. Also, there are other interesting, very Maiden-esque references on this album. Greek mythology, of course, in the guise of the Flight of Icarus, and what a great song that is. Again, one they thankfully they pulled out for the Legacy of the Beast tour. But it's it's an album that did very well. It hit number 2 in the UK charts, and the only reason this album wasn't a number 1 is because it was kept from the number 1 spot by the insanely popular Michael Jackson's Thriller. Anyway, it's my number 1, Peace of Mind from 1983. Anyway, that's how I would rank Iron Maiden's albums. Please give this video a thumbs up, please share it, please like, subscribe, check out the Facebook page, but more importantly, please do keep listening.